Have you ever pondered why you repeatedly make certain decisions, even when they seem to be against your best interest? Well, you're in good company. We all do it. And the key player behind this apparently illogical behavior is something we call bias. Now, before you disregard this as mere psychological jargon, allow me to illustrate. These biases act like unseen puppet masters, subtly controlling our thoughts, decisions, and actions daily. For example, the halo effect, a bias where you allow one trait, either good or bad, to overshadow other traits, characteristics, or facts. It can make you overlook glaring faults in a person because they are exceptionally talented in one area. Or consider the anchoring bias, where you rely too heavily on a piece of information you receive and base your decisions around it, potentially leading to misguided outcomes. Biases are like software running surreptitiously in the background of your mind, silently swaying your choices without your conscious awareness. They're akin to the autocorrect on your phone, your words before you've even finished typing. And much like autocorrect, biases don't always hit the mark. In this mind-broadening journey, we'll explore a prevalent type of bias that often misleads us: cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are systematic errors in thinking that affect the decisions and judgments that people make. They're often a result of your brain's attempt to simplify information processing. They perceptual distortion, inaccurate judgment, or illogical interpretation, and are hugely influential in our personal and professional lives, impacting everything from relationships to career choices, financial decisions, and more. And the most intriguing part, we're frequently entirely oblivious of their sway. Now that you're intrigued these hidden cognitive biases, let's explore the halo effect, anchoring bias, and others in more depth. Ever found yourself only paying attention to information that confirms your preconceptions? That, my friend, is referred to as the confirmation bias, another sneaky puppeteer that manipulates our decision-making process. The confirmation bias is a cognitive bias that leads us to favor information that echoes our existing beliefs or hypotheses. It's akin to being in an echo chamber, where everything we hear or see only amplifies our pre-existing beliefs. Instance, imagine you have a firm belief that a certain stock is going to perform well. You find articles and market trends that support this view while ignoring negative reports or declines in the stock's performance. This is a classic example of confirmation bias leading to overconfidence in personal beliefs. Similarly, suppose you strongly oppose a political candidate due to some personal beliefs. You might interpret a neutral statement from them as negative, further cementing your existing position. This selective interpretation of ambiguous evidence is another manifestation of confirmation bias. This bias doesn't just make us ignore contrary evidence, but sometimes it even leads us to misinterpret ambiguous evidence. It can lead to overconfidence, maintain or strengthen beliefs in the face of contrary evidence. It's like a filter that selectively lets in only the information that agrees with our views, while filtering out any information that them. This can be especially problematic when it comes to making important decisions, whether it's choosing a political candidate, making investment decisions, even deciding on medical treatment. To avoid the confirmation bias, it's important to seek out information from a range of sources and consider all possible outcomes. It may feel uncomfortable to challenge our own beliefs, but it's a necessary step for making objective decisions. Remember, it's important to challenge our own beliefs and consider all evidence, not just the ones that confirm what we already think. So the next time you find yourself nodding in agreement with everything you read, or stop and consider the confirmation bias. Are you really being objective, or is the confirmation bias skewing your perspective? Now let's move on to the next common bias, the halo effect. Ever found yourself assessing the likelihood of certain situations based on how quickly instances spring to mind? That, dear audience, is termed as the availability heuristic. It's a cognitive maneuver that depends on immediate instances that pop up effortlessly in our mind when we're assessing a specific subject, concept, method, or decision. The more readily an instance is at our disposal, the more gravity it holds in our perception. For instance, you might believe pickpocketing incidents are skyrocketing in your locality after watching a news report on a recent occurrence. The reason? The detailed, memorable report is still fresh in your memory. But here's the caveat. The availability heuristic, while sometimes useful, can lead us astray and result in significant judgment and decision-making mistakes. We often recall dramatic, jarring events like terrorist attacks more readily than commonplace happenings like car accidents. Consequently, we end up overestimating the probability of rare incidents. This is the availability heuristic in action, distorting our perception of our surroundings. Let's delve into some examples of how this heuristic can lead to errors in our judgment and decision-making process. Suppose you've recently read about a shark attack on a beach vacationer. Now, planning your own beach vacation, you might excessively worry about shark attacks, even though they are statistically rare. Or, a string of plane crashes highlighted in the news might lead you to believe that air travel is extremely dangerous, while in reality, it's one of the safest modes of transport. Therefore, it's essential not to solely rely on what's immediately accessible or recent. It's important to gather a comprehensive set of data, ponder potential outcomes, and not let dramatic, memorable events sway your decision-making process. Remember, an instance that comes to mind with ease is not necessarily the most accurate or representative one. So, the next time you catch yourself making a snap decision based on the first instance that comes to mind, pause and think about the availability heuristic. Are you allowing the simplicity of recall to tilt the balance? Now let's proceed with our exploration of biases, moving on to the next one, the halo effect. Have you ever observed that those who know the least often seem the most self-assured? This, my dear viewers, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. This cognitive bias causes individuals with low proficiency at a task to significantly overestimate their ability. It's as if they're blissfully ignorant of their own lack of skill. This is named after social psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, and is not restricted to any specific field. It's evident in various areas, from the workplace to the classroom. Consider a novice chess player who, after winning a couple of games, begins to think they could rival the grandmasters when they are miles away from that level of expertise. Or a beginner cook who, after successfully following a recipe or two, starts to believe they're the next Gordon Ramsay. These are classic examples of the Dunning-Kruger effect at work. However, here's the interesting part. As individuals acquire more knowledge and skills, their self-assessment of competence starts to dwindle. They begin to comprehend the depth of what they don't know. This is often referred to as the of despair or imposter syndrome. So, how do we avoid the Dunning-Kruger pitfall? It's crucial to remain open to feedback and to keep learning and improving. Understand that there's always more to learn and that not knowing everything is perfectly all right. Embrace constructive criticism and use it as a stepping stone for growth. Remember, confidence does not automatically equal competence. So the next time you're feeling particularly confident about a task, take a moment to reflect. Are you under the influence of the Dunning-Kruger effect? Are you genuinely skilled, or is it a mere illusion of competence? As we reflect on these questions, let's delve into another captivating cognitive bias. Ever noticed how people attribute their successes to their own abilities and efforts, but blame their failures on external factors? That, dear viewers, is what we call the self-serving bias. It's a cognitive bias where individuals credit their successes to their own abilities and efforts, but when things don't pan out, they attribute their failures to external factors. For instance, if you ace a test, you might attribute it to your intelligence and diligent studying. But if you fail, you might blame it on the difficulty of the questions or distractions during your study time. This can lead to a distorted perception of reality and can hinder personal growth. For example, a person who continuously fails in job interviews might blame the interviewer's bias or the competition instead of reflecting upon their own shortcomings, presentation or preparation. Similarly, a student who gets poor grades might blame the teaching methods rather than their own lack of discipline or effort. These instances demonstrate the self-serving bias, creating a skewed self-image, painting a picture of ourselves as infallible beings who are victims of circumstance when things don't go our way. This bias can prevent us from learning from our mistakes and improving. So, how do we avoid falling into the self-serving bias trap? It's essential to take responsibility for our failures, just as we celebrate our successes. Be humble in success and gracious in defeat. Understand that failure is not always a negative reflection of your abilities, but rather an opportunity for growth and learning. Similarly, Success isn't solely the result of your hard work and talent. Sometimes external factors like luck timing play a significant role. Remember, success and failure are often not as black and white as they seem. Our next bias might also surprise you. It's the halo effect. Ever caught yourself engaging in a certain behavior merely because everyone else was doing it? This is known as the bandwagon effect, a cognitive bias that pushes individuals to act or think a certain way just because they see others doing the same. It's like donning the latest fashion trend, even if it doesn't suit your style, or blindly supporting a hyped political candidate without fully exploring their policies. Let's consider the influence of social media, where viral trends often encourage people to participate without fully understanding the implications. Or think about a hit song that you didn't really like at first, but found yourself humming along after it topped the charts. That's the bandwagon effect at work. This psychological tendency can lead to groupthink, a situation where individuals suppress their own opinions or don't dare question popular views for fear of being ostracized. This can stifle originality, creativity, and lead to imprudent decision-making. For instance, if a new technology is the current rage, many companies might adopt it without fully assessing if it aligns with their business model just to maintain their industry relevance. Is a classic example of the bandwagon effect. So how can we evade this pitfall? It's essential to engage in critical and make decisions grounded in your own beliefs and values. Don't shy away from challenging popular opinion or standing out from the crowd. Remember, everyone else's involvement doesn't automatically signify the right course of action. Instead of blindly following the crowd, it's prudent to make informed decisions. After all, popularity doesn't always equate to quality, or suitability. In our onward journey, we will delve into another intriguing cognitive bias. Ever noticed how negative experiences seem to have a greater impact than positive ones? Let's dive deep into the negativity bias. This cognitive bias makes us more likely to focus on the bad rather than the good. It's like when you receive feedback on a project and you fixate on the one negative comment while overlooking numerous positive remarks. But this is not your fault, as our brains are wired this way for survival. Negativity bias can lead to a pessimistic worldview and can affect our mental health. For example, you may start believing that things are generally bad or going to get worse because you remember negative events more vividly than positive ones. In terms of mental health, constantly focusing on negative aspects can perpetuate feelings of anxiety, stress, or depression. It can also impact our decision-making. For instance, you may avoid taking risks due to fear of failure, even though the potential rewards could greatly outweigh the risks. So how do we counteract this bias? One way is by practicing gratitude and consciously focusing on positive experiences. This approach doesn't mean ignoring the negative aspects, but acknowledging them and not letting them overshadow the positives. It's about finding a balance. Remember, don't let the negatives outweigh the positives. If you're mindful of the negativity bias, you can take steps to ensure it doesn't unduly influence your decisions. And now let's move on to our next bias, the halo effect. Ever noticed how people often overestimate the likelihood of positive events happening to them? That's the optimism bias. This cognitive bias makes us believe that we are less likely to experience negative events compared to others. Consider how we buy a lottery ticket. Despite the astronomical odds, we believe we have a good chance of winning. Or how about when we smoke, eat unhealthy food, or don't exercise? We think somehow we won't suffer the adverse health effects. The optimism bias can lead us into a trap of unrealistic expectations and resultant disappointment. Instance, someone might start a business expecting immediate success and profit, only to face initial losses and hardships, leading to disillusionment and disappointment. Or a student might underestimate the amount of study needed for an exam, overconfident their abilities, only to perform poorly. While this bias isn't always detrimental, can motivate us to strive for our goals, it can also lead to underestimating risks and neglecting precautions. So, how do we keep our optimism bias in check? It's important to have realistic expectations and to prepare for different outcomes. This doesn't mean we should always expect the worst, but rather, we should be aware of the potential risks and challenges. It's about finding a balance between optimism and realism. Remember, it's good to be optimistic, but it's also important to be realistic. Now let's move on to our next bias, the halo effect. Have you ever felt so sure of your skills or knowledge that you didn't even consider the possibility of being wrong. That's the overconfidence effect. This cognitive bias causes us to overestimate our own abilities, knowledge, or the precision of our beliefs. It's like when we're so certain we'll ace a test without studying, or when we think we can easily handle a new project at work without prior experience. This overconfidence can lead us to make errors in judgment and decision-making. For instance, doctors might diagnose a patient incorrectly, convinced they don't need to run more tests. Or an investor might put all their money in a high-risk stock, sure of its success. We might also take unnecessary risks, like driving too fast on a road, sure of our ability to react to any situation. Or fail to prepare adequately for challenges, as with a mountaineer who attempts a difficult climb without adequate training or equipment. The overconfidence effect can also make us resistant to feedback and new information, as we are convinced that our beliefs or methods are the best. It's important to note that confidence is not a bad thing. It can drive us to take action and for success. However, overconfidence can blind us to our own limitations and potential pitfalls. To avoid falling into the overconfidence trap, it's crucial to constantly question our assumptions and seek feedback from others. We should also be open to new information and be willing to adjust our or strategies when necessary. Remember, confidence is good, but overconfidence can to mistakes. Now, let's move on to the next cognitive bias, the halo effect. Picture this scene. You're at a social gathering and your eyes land on an individual with a captivating smile, high-end attire, and a magnetic aura. Without even realizing it, you're likely to attribute more favorable qualities to them, like intelligence, kindness, and success, though you've had zero substantial interactions with this individual. This is the halo effect, a cognitive bias in action. Or consider another scenario. An applicant for a job arrives for an interview with a meticulously crafted resume. Instantly, you might presume them to possess exceptional interpersonal skills, even before they've opened their mouths to speak. That's the halo effect at work again. Another example could be of a defendant in a court case. A well-dressed, articulate defendant might be seen as more trustworthy or innocent, just based on their appearance and demeanour. Again, this is a demonstration of the halo effect. These situations all underline one thing. The halo effect is not a deliberate or conscious process. It's a reflex deeply ingrained in our cognitive system. But acknowledging it is the first step towards decreasing its influence on our judgments and decisions. The halo effect serves as a reminder we should not let a single trait, whether positive or negative, obscure our overall perception of a person or situation. It pushes us to go beyond preliminary impressions and probe deeper, leading us to strive for a more comprehensive, nuanced understanding. So, the next time you find yourself prematurely judging someone based on a single positive trait, pause and remember the halo effect. Challenge yourself to look beyond the surface and make well-rounded, informed judgments. Remember, an appealing exterior doesn't always mean a beautiful interior. Now, let's delve into our second cognitive bias, the anchoring bias. Ever found yourself clinging to the first piece of information you received, despite new evidence suggesting otherwise? This is a classic example of the anchoring bias. It's a peculiar trait of the human mind. Picture yourself in a negotiation scenario. The first figure tabled serves as an anchor. This anchor then becomes the focal point of all subsequent conversations. The anchoring bias often compels us to disregard additional pertinent details that could nudge our decision in another direction. Let's delve into some concrete examples. Consider first impressions. The old saying goes, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. This perfectly exemplifies the anchoring bias. The initial impression someone forms on us can profoundly shape our perception of them, even when we encounter fresh facts that contradict this initial judgment. A job interview situation, for instance, if a candidate leaves a positive impression in the initial minutes, that impression becomes the anchor. Despite a few slip-ups later on, the interviewer might still hold on to that first favourable impression, overlooking the candidate's subsequent errors. Likewise, the anchoring bias can lead us down the wrong path. It's crucial to remember that our initial information or impression isn't foolproof. Our minds are inclined to overemphasize this initial data, often resulting in a distorted understanding of reality. So, what's the antidote to this cognitive trap? Embrace new information with an open mind. Don't allow your initial impressions or the first piece of information to sway your judgment. Strive to review all accessible data before arriving at a decision. It is perfectly acceptable to alter your stand when presented with fresh evidence. The anchoring bias, a captivating cognitive bias, holds significant sway over our decision-making process. By acknowledging its presence, we can take measures to lessen its influence, resulting in more balanced and well-informed decisions. Remember, the first piece of information isn't always the most trustworthy. Stay open to new. Awareness of these biases is the first step to overcoming them. But what's next? Now that we've discussed the hidden biases within us, the halo effect, and the first impression trap, it's time to delve into how we can counteract these biases for better decision-making. The first step is recognition. It's essential to understand that biases are a part of human nature, and they're not inherently bad. They're cognitive shortcuts our brain uses to process information quickly. Consider an instance where you're hiring for a position, and you instantly like a candidate because they remind you of a successful colleague. That's an unconscious bias at work. However, when these biases cloud our judgment and lead to unfair or unjust decisions, that's when they become problematic. So the next time you're faced with a decision, take a moment to pause and reflect. Ask yourself, am I being influenced by a bias here? Is there a halo effect at play? Critical thinking is the second step. This involves questioning our assumptions and beliefs. For example, if you find yourself making a judgment based on a first impression, challenge that judgment. You might assume a quiet person at a meeting doesn't have any valuable ideas, but is that really true? Ask, what evidence do I have to support this belief? Could there be other factors I'm not considering? The third step is mindfulness. This is a form of mental training that helps us stay present and engaged in the current moment without judgment. It allows us to see things as they are, not as we think they should be. By practicing mindfulness, we can better recognize when our biases are influencing our decisions and take steps to correct them. Lastly, it's important to remember that overcoming biases is a continuous process. It requires patience, practice, and a willingness to change. It's not about achieving perfection, but about striving for progress. By recognizing and overcoming our biases, we can make more effective and successful decisions in different areas of life, whether in our personal relationships, our work, or interactions with the world around us. So the next time you're faced with a decision, pause, reflect, and question your assumptions. After all, awareness is the key to change.